The year is 1939. The world stands on the precipice of the most devastating conflict in human history. But how did we arrive at this moment? The path to global war wasn't carved overnight, it was forged through decades of unresolved tensions, broken promises, and a series of decisions that would reshape the world forever. Today, we'll trace the complex web of events that led to the outbreak of World War II. From the ashes of the previous Great War to the political upheavals of the 1930s, we'll explore how a fragile peace crumbled and gave way to unprecedented destruction. This is the story of how the world stumbled toward its darkest hour, the road to 1939. To understand 1939, we must first return to 1918. The Great War had ended, but the peace that followed was built on shaky foundations. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh conditions on Germany, demanding massive reparations and territorial concessions that would fuel resentment for decades. The victorious powers redrew the map of Europe, creating new nations and dissolving old empires. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire crumbled, giving birth to new countries in Central Europe. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, leaving a power vacuum in the Middle East. But perhaps most significantly, the treaty's harsh treatment of Germany created a narrative of humiliation and betrayal that extremist movements would later exploit. The German people, struggling under economic hardship and national shame, became fertile ground for radical ideologies. Meanwhile, the newly formed League of Nations promised collective security and international cooperation. Yet from its inception, it faced challenges that would prove insurmountable. Key powers either refused to join or later withdrew, leaving the organization without the strength to enforce its ideals. The seeds of future conflict were already being sown in the very documents meant to ensure lasting peace. The 1920s and early 1930s witnessed the rise of authoritarian movements across Europe. In Germany, a failed Austrian artist turned politician capitalized on economic despair and national humiliation to build a movement based on extreme nationalism and racial ideology. The extremist party's rise to power wasn't immediate or inevitable. It exploited the weaknesses of democratic institutions, using both legal political processes and violent intimidation to gain control. By 1933, they had transformed Germany from a struggling democracy into a totalitarian state. Across the Alps, Italy had already fallen under the control of a fascist regime led by a charismatic dictator who promised to restore the nation's former glory. This leader pioneered many of the tactics that other extremist movements would later adopt: the cult of personality, mass rallies, and the systematic suppression of opposition. In the Soviet Union, a brutal leader consolidated power through purges and terror, transforming the communist state into a personal dictatorship. While ideologically opposed to fascism, his regime shared many of its authoritarian characteristics. These three powers would reshape the political landscape of Europe, setting the stage for the conflicts to come. Their leaders, driven by ambition and ideology, would make decisions that plunged the world into war. As extremist movements gained power, the international community struggled to respond effectively. The policy of appeasement, pursued by Britain and France, aimed to maintain peace by making concessions to aggressive powers. This approach, while well-intentioned, would prove catastrophically miscalculated. The first major test came in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria, flagrantly violating international law and League of Nations principles. The international response was weak and ineffective, sending a message that aggressive actions would face little consequence. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, again challenging the international order. Despite sanctions imposed by the League of Nations, the invasion succeeded, further undermining faith in collective security. The extremist leader's victory demonstrated that determined aggression could overcome international opposition. Meanwhile, Germany began systematically violating the Treaty of Versailles. Rearmament programs, forbidden under the treaty, proceeded openly. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was met with no military response from France or Britain, despite being a clear breach of international agreements. Each successful challenge to the international order emboldened the aggressors and weakened the resolve of democratic nations. The pattern was clear: aggressive actions faced minimal consequences, while negotiation and compromise were seen as signs of weakness. The spring and summer of 1939 saw frantic diplomatic activity as Europe teetered on the brink of war. Germany's next target was clearly Poland, and this time, Britain and France were determined to honor their commitments to their ally. The Polish corridor and the Free City of Danzig became the focal points of tension. Germany demanded the return of territories lost after World War I, while Poland, backed by Western guarantees, refused to yield. The stage was set for confrontation. Meanwhile, a shocking diplomatic revolution was taking place in secret. Despite their ideological opposition, extremist Germany and the Soviet Union began negotiating a non-aggression pact. This agreement would free Germany from the threat of a two-front war while giving the Soviets time to prepare for what many saw as an inevitable clash. The pact, signed in August 1939, included secret protocols for the partition of Poland and the Baltic states. This cynical agreement between mortal enemies stunned the world and removed the last diplomatic obstacle to German aggression. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Germany was free to act. The extremist leadership had calculated that Britain and France, despite their guarantees, would not actually go to war over Poland. This would prove to be their most fateful miscalculation. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The attack was swift and overwhelming, employing new tactics that combined air power, tanks, and motorized infantry in what would become known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. The invasion was preceded by a false flag operation designed to justify the aggression, but the international community was not fooled. This time, there would be no more appeasement, no more negotiations. Lines had been drawn that could not be crossed. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their commitments to Poland. The British Prime Minister's solemn radio address to the nation marked the beginning of what would become the most destructive conflict in human history. The Soviet Union, true to its secret agreement, invaded Poland from the east on September 17, sealing the country's fate. Poland fought bravely but was overwhelmed by enemies on two fronts. By early October, Polish resistance had collapsed. What began as a European conflict would soon engulf the globe. The extremist powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan would form the Axis alliance, while Britain, France, and eventually the Soviet Union and United States would lead the Allies in. The road to 1939 was not a sudden descent into chaos, but a long and uneasy journey marked by missed opportunities, failed diplomacy, and the gradual erosion of international norms. The warnings were there, clear and unmistakable, yet too often ignored or dismissed in the hope that compromise could preserve stability. The rise of extremist ideologies across Europe fed on resentment, fear, and economic despair, while the democratic nations, scarred by the horrors of the previous war, hesitated to confront aggression when it first appeared. The weakness of collective security and the inability of international institutions to enforce their own principles meant that treaties and promises offered little real protection. Each act of unchecked expansion and intimidation emboldened aggressors further, proving that weakness and delay would only invite greater challenges. The lessons of this period remain deeply relevant to the present. History demonstrates the critical importance of standing up to aggression early, before small violations grow into global catastrophes. The danger of appeasing extremist regimes, even with the best of intentions, lies in the message it sends, that power and intimidation can achieve more than negotiation and law. Equally vital is the need for strong international institutions, bodies capable not only of promoting dialogue but of taking meaningful action when peace is threatened. Without credibility, such institutions become hollow, as the League of Nations did in the 1930s, a symbol of noble ideals undermined by inaction. World War II would cost the lives of more than 70 million people, devastate entire continents, and reshape the political, economic, and moral order of the modern world. Yet perhaps its greatest legacy is not only the destruction it wrought but the stark reminder it left: freedom and peace are never permanent achievements. They must be actively defended, nurtured, and renewed by each generation, or they risk slipping away. The road to 1939 teaches us that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and that the choices we make in moments of crisis, whether to resist or to yield, to act or to delay, echo far beyond their immediate moment. Those choices shape the future, determining whether humanity moves toward stability and justice, or stumbles once again into darkness.